You spent 15 years clicking buttons so the organization wouldn't break. Access reviews, quarterly approvals, permission audits, lifecycle policies. You were the arbiter of every decision the system couldn't make alone. You were competent, you were careful, you documented everything, you stayed late, you got paged at 2 in the morning because some regional manager needed access to a SharePoint site that no longer had an owner. The system didn't fail because you failed. The system failed because it required you to exist. Think about that for a moment. Not as criticism, as architecture. You were the compensation mechanism for a platform that operated at machine speed, provisioning identities in milliseconds, creating Teams workspaces instantly, inheriting permissions automatically, while demanding human oversight in quarterly batches. Every moment you weren't reviewing something, the system continued making decisions without you. Every policy you wrote was static. Every exception you granted became permanent. Configuration drifted, entropy accumulated. By the time you realized the policies were unmaintainable, they were already unmaintainable. You weren't slow. The system was designed to move faster than humans can govern. That's not a failure of execution. That's a design omission. What replaced you wasn't a tool. It wasn't Copilot. It wasn't Power Automate or some new Microsoft 365 feature bundle. What replaced you was the removal of the need for human latency from the authorization loop entirely. Decisions that once required your approval now happen continuously. Access that once lived forever now expires by default. Policies that once required manual tuning now adjust based on real-time signals. The system doesn't wait for you anymore. It enforces intent. This is satisfying because it's honest. It acknowledges what was always true. You were a bottleneck in an authorization engine that needed to move faster. Not because you were bad at it, because no human can keep pace with machine speed at scale. By the end of this, you'll understand why the downfall of manual administration wasn't a tragedy. It was inevitable. You'll see how the gap between decision speed and approval speed created entropy that no amount of diligence could manage. You'll understand why the system needed something else. Not better admins, but no admins in the decision loop at all. And here's the part that matters. The architects who understood this early are now designing the systems that replace them. They're not clicking buttons anymore. They're defining intent. They're writing the rules that agents enforce. They're the difference between a system that moves faster than it can be governed and a system that's deterministic by design. The question isn't whether manual administration is going away. It's already gone. The question is whether you'll be the one who understands why or the one still defending the buttons. The illusion of control. Let's start where every manual admin story begins. The belief that you were in control. You had the global admin role. You had permissions to everything. Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, Entra, Purview. Every system in the tenant flowed through your credentials. You were the apex of the organizational hierarchy. The system deferred to you. Except that's not what was happening. That's not what it ever was. The global admin role wasn't an expression of your authority. It was an architectural confession. It existed because the system couldn't decide what you should have. It couldn't define scope. It couldn't enforce boundaries. So it gave you everything and hoped you'd use good judgment. That's not governance. That's delegation of the problem to maybe someday we'll fix this. Look at what actually happened when you tried to use that power. Every quarterly access review landed on your desk. You dutifully sent out notifications asking owners to certify that users still needed their roles. 40% didn't respond. You couldn't revoke access from people who didn't say anything. The organization needed them to work. So you approved by default. You documented the approval. You moved to the next one. That wasn't you reviewing access. That was you documenting compliance theater. The real architecture was simpler and darker. Every person who had ever been granted access to something kept that access until someone explicitly removed them. And since no one was going to take the political risk of removing someone's access without explicit instruction, the access persisted. It compounded. Permissions inherited. Users changed roles. The systems they'd been granted access to were forgotten. New SharePoint sites were created with the same default permissions as the old ones. By year 3, half your organization had standing privilege to systems they'd never used. You weren't failing to manage it. The system was designed to prevent you from managing it. Standing privilege isn't security. It's architectural laziness wrapped in permission inheritance. The system couldn't decide this person should have access to this, but only during work hours, only from a managed device, only if risk signals don't spike. So it chose the default. Access is on forever until someone cares enough to turn it off. And since no one cares, because caring means managing permissions, it stays on. Every exception you granted became a permanent rule. Someone needed elevated access for 72 hours. You granted it. They used it. Then you forgot to revoke it, or they asked for a grace period, or there was a change freeze, or you documented it for later review and later never came. The access didn't expire. Standing privilege expanded. The system continued making decisions without you. Here's the part that matters. You could see this happening. You understood it. Every competent admin I've ever known spent at least 20% of their time managing the consequences of permanent access and permission inheritance. But understanding the problem and fixing it are different things. You couldn't fix it because the system was broken by design, not by implementation. The platform operated at machine speed. Identities were provisioned in seconds. Teams were created instantly. Permissions were inherited automatically. But access governance operated at human speed. Quarterly batches, manual reviews, documented approvals. The gap between how fast the system created things and how fast you could govern them grew every quarter. You weren't overworked because access management was complicated. You were overworked because the system had decided to give every user access to everything until you personally revoked it. And you can't revoke what you don't know exists. That wasn't control. Control would have meant the system made decisions based on defined rules. What you had was the illusion of control, the authority to document choices that were already made. Why human speed was never going to work. The fundamental flaw wasn't operational, it was architectural. Microsoft 365 doesn't operate at human speed, it operates at machine speed. That's not a metaphor, that's a measurable gap that grows wider every day. A team's workspace is created in milliseconds. Permissions are inherited instantly. A user gets access to a file by virtue of being in a group. A distribution list expands automatically. An approval workflow triggers. A compliance rule applies. All of this happens at nanosecond scale. The system makes thousands of authorization decisions every second without waiting for you to blink. Then you review that team's workspace in days. You audit the permission inheritance in quarters. You notice the compliance drift in the monthly report. By that time, the system has already made the next 1,000 decisions and moved on. You were never fast enough. Not because you were slow, because the system was designed to move faster than humans can govern. A permission is inherited in nanoseconds. You audit it in 90 days. In that gap, the system has made 90 million authorization decisions. You're reviewing one, thinking you found the problem, not understanding that by the time you document it, the system has already created 10 new variants of the same problem. This isn't about hiring faster admins or better tools. This is about the mathematical impossibility of human oversight keeping pace with automated decision-making at scale. Here's how entropy accumulates in that gap. Every moment you don't act, the system continues making decisions without you. A team site is created with default settings. You don't know about it. The system didn't ask permission. It just created it. Ownership gets assigned to the person who created the team. They leave the company. The team stays. Now it's orphaned. The system doesn't care. The system has moved on to creating the next 1,000 teams. You find the orphaned team 3 months later. You check whether it has sensitive data. It does. You check who has access. 40 people from 3 different departments. You check whether it was supposed to be there. No one knows. You reach out to the original owner. They've already left. You document that it needs review. You schedule it for the next governance meeting. The meeting is in 6 weeks. By then, someone will have shared another 100 files into that same team because the system doesn't know it's orphaned. It just knows the team exists and the permissions allow it. That's entropy. Configuration drift, shadow sites, ungoverned access. It's not created by chaos. It's created by the deliberate gap between machine speed decision-making and human speed oversight. You were not hired to move faster than the system. You were hired because the system couldn't move slower. The platform was built for distributed teams, instant collaboration, automatic inheritance, and ask forgiveness later permissions. It was built for speed. It was built to scale. It was built for a world where the bottleneck was collaboration, not governance. And it worked. The system enabled organizations to move fast. Teams could be created in minutes. Users could get access to resources instantly. Collaboration happened without friction. The trade-off was that governance had to happen later after the fact in cleanup mode, and cleanup mode at scale is not governance, it's damage assessment. Every competent admin understood this trade-off. You could move fast or you could be certain, but not both. The system chose fast. You were hired to manage the certainty debt that accumulated as a consequence. But here's what you couldn't do. You couldn't make the system move slower. You couldn't convince it to ask permission before creating things. You couldn't make it wait for approval before inheriting permissions. You couldn't reprogram 90 years of Microsoft's automation philosophy because one administrator was struggling to keep up. You were not solving a problem. You were managing the consequences of a design choice that was made before you arrived and would persist long after you left. The gap between machine speed and human speed isn't closing. Every year the system gets faster. Every quarter there are more decisions to govern. Every month the entropy grows. And every day you're trying to do something that was always mathematically impossible. Approve decisions at human speed for a system that operates at machine speed. That's not a failure of administration. That's the architectural inevitability that makes manual administration obsolete by definition. The entropy generator. This gap between speed and oversight didn't create isolated problems. It created a system-wide mechanism that guaranteed entropy at scale. Every policy exception you granted became a permanent rule. Someone needed access to a sensitive SharePoint site for a project. They made the request. You reviewed it. You approved it. The project ended. The access stayed. 6 months later, they left the company. The access persisted. A year later, someone asked why they had access to the site. No one knew. You looked it up. The original justification was archived. The project was complete, but removing it felt risky. What if something broke? What if they still needed it for something? So you documented it for review and scheduled the removal for next quarter. Next quarter came. There were 50 items in the queue. You got to this one, saw there was no recent activity, marked it as will investigate further, and moved on. That's not a policy exception anymore. That's standing privilege. Every just this once access became permanent standing access because you couldn't revoke what was never formally granted, what had no documented reason, what no one remembered requesting. The system had no concept of this access was supposed to be temporary. It knew access existed. It didn't know why. Without explicit reason, you couldn't revoke it. Every unlabeled file became a governance blind spot. SharePoint stores millions of files. Most are never labeled. Most never touch a sensitivity classification. Someone puts a spreadsheet in a public SharePoint site because that's where their team collaborates. The spreadsheet contains salary data. No one labeled it. No one encrypted it. No one restricted access to it. The system doesn't flag it because the system has no way to know what a spreadsheet contains without opening it and analyzing it. You'd need to scan every file, classify every document, apply every label. You could hire 3 people and run them full-time for a year and still not finish. So the files stay unlabeled. The governance blind spot persists. Configuration drift isn't caused by bad configuration, it's caused by the absence of continuous evaluation. This is where the mechanism accelerates. Configuration drift wasn't a bug you could patch. It was the inevitable outcome of a system designed to operate faster than humans can govern. Every policy you didn't enforce created a precedent. Every exception you allowed became a template for the next exception. Every compromise you made to keep the business moving was a data point the system remembered. You approved external sharing for one user. Now every user assumes external sharing is allowed. You granted elevated privilege for one team. Now every team requests it. You exempted one policy. Now every department claims they deserve the same exemption. Entropy compounds. One exception becomes 10, becomes 100, becomes 10,000. The rules fragment. The policies contradict. The system operates according to competing precedents. Configuration becomes subjective. Enforcement becomes inconsistent. Governance becomes theater. By 2026, most organizations had accumulated so much entropy that manual review was mathematically impossible. You couldn't audit your way out of it. You couldn't enforce your way through it. The system had created too many exceptions, too many special cases, too many workarounds. A competent admin looked at the state of permission inheritance across a mid-sized tenant and understood this isn't something that can be manually governed. This is something that has to be completely rebuilt from first principles. And by then you were already years behind. You weren't behind on work. The work was behind on you. The system had been making unauthorized decisions faster than you could document what decisions were already made. That's not administrative failure. That's the mechanics of entropy in a system where decisions are made automatically and governance happens in batches. The system wins every time because the system doesn't need your permission to run. It just needs you to approve its decisions after they're already made. And by then, it's already made the next 10,000th and the conditional chaos problem. The real architectural failure wasn't in what you did, it was in how the system forced you to make decisions. Conditional access policies started as clean logic, simple, deterministic. If user is in high-risk group, then deny access unless they're using a compliant device and have MFA enabled. That's a rule, that's governance, that's a statement of security intent that a machine can enforce consistently. But then the business needed an exception. Sales needed access from home on personal devices, so you added an exception clause. If user is in sales and it's after hours, then allow it. Now your policy reads, if high-risk group, deny, except if sales after hours. Then IT needed to disable the rule for their own team during maintenance windows. So you added another clause, unless the user is in IT and the time is 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. on Tuesday. Then there was a contractor who needed access just for the fiscal year, so you added temporal logic. But if the user's access expires on this date, allow it anyway. Then there was the executive who needed access from anywhere, anytime, for anything, because executives never follow policies. So you added a carve-out, maybe Q, if the user is flagged as executive. You didn't make bad decisions, you made reasonable exceptions to reasonable policies, but each exception clause converted your deterministic security model into something else entirely, a probabilistic system where the outcome of any given access attempt depended on a tangle of overlapping exceptions, carve-outs, temporal rules, and special cases. By the time you had written 5 policies covering the main security posture and added exceptions for sales, IT, contractors, executives, regional requirements, and compliance exceptions, you were no longer writing policy. You were writing conditional chaos. Here's what happened to the next audit. You inherited someone else's conditional access policies from the previous admin. You need to understand whether access is being controlled properly. So you read the policy. If location is not trusted, deny access except if device is managed unless the user is in a group called exec exceptions. But if the user has activated PIM in the last 10 minutes, allow them anyway. You stop reading. You have no idea what this policy actually does. Not because you're not smart enough, because the policy itself is incoherent. The logic has become so layered that predicting the outcome of any specific access attempt requires you to trace through 6 nested conditions, each of which depends on states that change in real time. You can't audit that. You can't reason about it. You can't predict whether a new threat pattern will be caught or will slip through. Each exception made the next threat response slower. A new attack vector emerges. You need to block access from a certain country, but you have to check whether any of your exceptions would allow it anyway. You find that your executives can access from anywhere. Carve-out bypasses the country-based block, so you add another exception to the exception, unless the threat is a country-based block. Now you have a policy about a policy about a policy. The system didn't fail because you made bad decisions. The system failed because humans can't maintain logical consistency at scale. You understood every individual exception. Each one made sense in the moment, but the aggregate, the interaction of 20 exception clauses across 10 policies affecting 300 users, was no longer something a human brain could coherently hold. By the time you realized the policies were unmanageable, they were already unmaintainable. You couldn't simplify them without potentially breaking something. You couldn't audit them without spending weeks reverse engineering the logic. You couldn't update them without risking unforeseen consequences. So you stopped updating them. They calcified. They became legacy. They persisted not because they were a good policy, but because no one was confident enough to change them. That's when you understood. You weren't managing a security model. You were managing the wreckage of a security model that had been undermined by 1,000 reasonable compromises. Access reviews as theater. Let's talk about the ritual that every admin knows is broken. The quarterly access review, the checkbox that made leadership feel secure while being entirely theater. Here's how it works. Microsoft says you should review access every 90 days. It's a best practice. It's a control. It demonstrates due diligence. So you set it up. Every quarter, you send notifications to team owners. Please certify that the following users still need access to this team. Respond by Friday or we'll assume you approve. 40% don't respond. You can't block 40% of your organization's access. The business breaks. Teams can't communicate. Projects stall. Users call the help desk. The help desk calls you. You're blamed for blocking access that the business needed. So you approve by default. You document the approval. You move to the next batch. What you've just done is perform an access review where access that no one confirmed is required now has documented approval. You've created a compliance artifact that proves you reviewed it. You haven't actually reviewed anything. You've documented that the owner didn't respond and you approved it anyway. Consider what's actually in those permissions. Some of it is there because someone granted it 4 years ago. That person left the company 2 years ago. The access remained. It never expires. It's never reviewed because the original owner can't respond. They're not in the organization anymore. But their legacy access persists. Now you're approving access that was granted by someone who isn't employed anymore for reasons that are undocumented to resources they may no longer even know exist. That's not governance. That's necromancy. The real problem is this. The system requires you to make a decision every 90 days that should never have needed making in the first place. If access was supposed to be temporary, it should have expired. If it required periodic review, the system should have built in expiration criteria. If it should have been revoked when someone changed roles, the system should have revoked it automatically. Instead, the system creates access that lives forever. Then it requires humans to remember that it exists, verify that it's still needed, and manually revoke it on a 90-day cycle, forever, for every user, for every role, for every resource. Multiply that by thousands of users and hundreds of resources, and you're asking humans to make millions of decisions that a machine should have made once at creation time with clear expiration built in. Here's what makes it theater. The approval you're documenting isn't based on information. It's based on absence of objection. You approve because no one said no. That's not review, that's default permit. And default permit is what you get when the system is designed to assume access should be granted unless there's a specific reason to revoke it. The system didn't start this way by accident. It started this way because access decisions are philosophically hard to make at the moment of grant. So the system defers the decision. Access is granted tentatively. The decision to revoke is pushed to the future. Now it's quarterly, now it's your problem. But here's the architectural truth. If you needed human review every 90 days to decide whether to keep access, then the system created access that was already uncertain at grant time. The system didn't know whether the access should exist, so it created it anyway and asked you to figure it out later. By doing quarterly access reviews, you're not governing access. You're performing the illusion of governance. You're creating artifacts that prove someone examined it. The examination is non-existent. The approval is automatic. The whole exercise is theater designed to satisfy auditors while not addressing the fundamental problem. Access that should have expiration criteria built in is treated as if it should live forever and be reviewed periodically to justify that eternal existence. That's the system you were asked to defend, and the system is indefensible. The Lifecycle sprawl. Teams and SharePoint sites tell the same story as everything else you've been trying to govern. The story of a system that creates complexity faster than you can manage it. A team is created in seconds. Someone clicks a button, the team exists. Ownership is assigned to whoever created it. The team has default settings. Everyone in the organization can find it. Some teams are for projects, some are for departments, some are for informal collaboration. Some are created as experiments and abandoned. The system doesn't distinguish between them. It creates them all at the same speed. It stores them all with the same resources. It keeps them all forever. That's the design. Create instantly. Store indefinitely. Expect humans to clean up later. Owners leave the organization. The team persists. No one knows who owns it anymore. You might have automation that detects orphaned teams. Someone left, the owner flag is no longer valid, but you can't delete it. What if someone in a different department is still using it for something? What if there's data in the team that's needed for compliance purposes? What if a user calls in a panic because a team they didn't know they were a member of suddenly became inaccessible? You're liable for the data loss. You're liable for the access disruption. You're liable for the archive that wasn't preserved. So the orphaned team stays, unowned, ungoverned, slowly accumulating data that no one intends to be there anymore because the system keeps accepting uploads and file shares from anyone who has access to the team. Data retention policies are written once, never tuned. You set a policy. Delete teams after 2 years of inactivity. It sounds reasonable. 2 years is a long time. If a team hasn't been used in 2 years, it's probably dead, except you wrote that policy 3 years ago. You never checked whether it's working. You never looked at what's being deleted. You never measured whether 2 years is actually the right threshold. It just sits there, firing automatically, deleting things according to logic that made sense in a different business context. By year 3, no one knows what half the sites contain. SharePoint storage is cheap. It's easier to archive sites than delete them. It's easier to let them sit there than to investigate whether they contain important data. A site gets archived. Then someone asks for files from a project that ended 5 years ago. The site is archived. You have to restore it. The restore takes time. The files are recovered. No one has time to re-archive it properly. So it sits in the archive queue half restored. This happens 1,000 times. Now you have thousands of sites in unknown states of partial restoration. You can't delete them because someone might need them. That's the phrase you hear every time you propose cleanup. Someone might need them. In a 100-person organization, there are probably 500 archived or dormant sites. One of them might contain something that a single person needs one day. So you keep them all. You pay for storage. You pay for the backup licensing. You pay for the compliance burden of keeping data you don't know exists anymore. You can't keep them because they're consuming resources and creating security surface. An archived site is still a site. It still has a SharePoint structure. It still has permission inheritance. It still has potential vulnerabilities. If the owning team no longer exists, who's responsible for security? If the site wasn't reviewed in 5 years, what's the permission state? Who can access it? What if there's a breach and the attacker finds an orphaned site with 4 years of unencrypted email exports sitting in it? This is the Lifecycle sprawl. The system created sites faster than you could govern them. They accumulate, they persist, they fragment. The state of any given site becomes unknowable. You spend your time arguing with business units about whether sites can be deleted. You send compliance notifications. You set up retention policies. You create archive workflows. You build your entire administrative practice around managing the consequences of a system that decided to create unlimited sites and store them indefinitely. By 2026, the lifecycle sprawl was one of the primary reasons that Copilot deployment stalled. You couldn't deploy an AI system that could see and act on this data until you'd cleaned up the data itself. And you couldn't clean it up because the system had been creating it faster than you could categorize it. That's not a cleanup problem, that's a design problem, and cleanup is the wrong answer. The shadow AI moment. This is where the story gets interesting. This is where manual administration finally broke. 57% of employees use personal accounts for AI tools because IT approval takes too long. Not because they're insubordinate, because they're pragmatic, because they understand something you haven't articulated yet. The system moves faster than the governance process. The business needs an answer. ChatGPT provides it in 2 minutes. Your approval process takes 2 weeks. The business uses ChatGPT. Your approval process becomes irrelevant. They're not bypassing you because you're incompetent. They're bypassing you because you represent latency, and latency is now a competitive disadvantage. Think about the timeline. An employee needs to analyze data. They ask IT for a tool. IT creates a ticket. IT assigns it to someone. Someone checks whether the tool is on the approved list. It's not. Someone starts the evaluation process. Is this tool compliant? Does it meet security standards? Is there licensing? What's the data exposure? The evaluation takes weeks, maybe a month. Meanwhile, the employee has already used ChatGPT to solve the problem. They've moved on to the next problem. They've actually forgotten they made the request. Then the approval comes through. The tool is now approved. The employee doesn't need it anymore, but it's approved, so someone else uses it. Then someone else. Now you have shadow tools proliferating because the approval process finally caught up to a problem that was already solved. Shadow AI isn't a security failure. It's proof that the manual approval process was already dead. Here's what you couldn't see from inside the approval workflow. Every day that approval took, the system moved faster. Every week that you were evaluating compliance, the employee was already compliant with the business requirement. They'd solved it themselves. Every month that you documented due diligence, the business had already moved on to a new problem. The approval was no longer about enabling the business. It was about creating audit artifacts for decisions that had already been made without you. The system didn't need you to approve it. The system needed you to get out of the way. And when you didn't, when you insisted on your gatekeeping role, when you enforced your approval process, the business simply worked around you, not maliciously, pragmatically. Because the cost of waiting for approval became greater than the risk of shadow tools. This is the moment that mattered. This is when you realized the manual admin bottleneck had become more dangerous than the risks you were trying to prevent. When employees chose unsanctioned tools over approved workflows, when the business voted with their feet, when they looked at your governance process and decided that not waiting for it was worth the security risk. That's not criticism, that's the system telling you something. It's telling you that your approval was the bottleneck, not the tool, not the security, your approval. By 2026, shadow AI was massive. 60 to 70% of organizations reported that employees were using unsanctioned tools, not because of malice, because of speed, because asking for permission took longer than solving the problem themselves. Organizations tried to crack down on shadow AI. They blocked download sites. They monitored proxy logs. They sent compliance training. And employees kept using unsanctioned tools anyway because the business moved faster than the governance process. This was the moment the architecture revealed itself. The system was designed to operate at machine speed. Decisions happened instantly. Users got things done fast. But approvals happened at human speed, and human speed was now slower than no approval at all. It was better for the business to operate in shadow than to wait for official sanction. You understood finally what was happening. You weren't protecting the organization from risk. You were slowing down the organization to the point where they chose risk over speed. That's not governance. That's organizational friction so severe that the organization has to root around you. And that's the moment you realized manual administration didn't fail because it was done wrong. It failed because approval itself had become the wrong answer. The realization. This is the moment when the architecture becomes undeniable. You're sitting in a meeting. Someone is asking you to implement yet another policy exception, another carve-out, another temporal rule, another special case for another business unit. And you realize suddenly that you're not solving anything. You're not building governance. You're not creating policy. You're performing the illusion of control by adding complexity to a system that's already too complex to reason about. And then it hits you. This isn't a problem you can solve by clicking faster or documenting better or staying later. This isn't a problem that another admin could fix. This isn't even a problem that a team of admins could fix. Manual administration wasn't inefficient. It was architecturally impossible. You didn't fail because you were slow. You failed because no human can maintain logical consistency at the speed and scale that Microsoft 365 operates. No person can approve decisions faster than a system creates them. No policy can adapt to exceptions faster than exceptions emerge. No governance framework can remain coherent once you've added enough carve-outs that the base policy is no longer recognizable. Every policy you wrote was a temporary band-aid on a permanent architectural problem. You'd identify a risk. You'd write a policy. The policy would work for 3 months. Then exceptions would start emerging. Then the exceptions would accumulate. Then the policy would be so covered in caveats that it no longer meant anything. Then you'd write a new policy and the cycle would repeat. You were never going to win. Not because you weren't trying hard enough, because the system was designed to move faster than you could govern it. Here's the realization that matters. The flaw wasn't in execution. The flaw was in the assumption that humans could be the control mechanism for a system operating at machine speed. The system creates thousands of identities a minute. Thousands of permissions, thousands of decisions, and the assumption was that a human could review these decisions quarterly and keep up. That assumption was never valid. It was valid for an organization with 100 users, maybe 1,000, but at scale, with tens of thousands of users and millions of decisions happening daily, the assumption broke down completely. Every quarter you'd fall further behind. Every new feature Microsoft released would create new decisions to govern. Every new user would inherit permissions from predecessors. Every team would spawn new sites with default settings. The system would accelerate and you would decelerate, and the gap between them would widen. By the time you understood that you were losing, you'd already lost. The entropy had compounded. The policies had calcified. The exceptions had become rules. The system was operating according to its own logic, not according to any governance you'd imposed. You were just documenting what it had already decided. The real question wasn't, how do we do this faster? That was the wrong question. That question assumed that the problem was speed. That if you just moved faster, clicked buttons more efficiently, reviewed policies more rigorously, you could keep up with the system. You couldn't. No human could. Speed wasn't the constraint. The constraint was that humans had to be in the decision loop at all. The real question was different. The real question was, how do we remove the need for human approval from the authorization engine entirely? Not how do we make human approval faster? Not how do we make human approval more consistent? How do we eliminate human approval as the governing mechanism for a system that operates at machine speed? That question changed everything. Because once you asked it, you understood that the system didn't need you to approve better. The system needed you to stop approving and start defining intent. It needed you to write rules once. cleanly, without exceptions, and let the system enforce them deterministically. It needed the authorization engine to make decisions based on defined policy, not based on human review. It needed the removal of human latency from the authorization loop entirely. That's not an operational improvement. That's an architectural revolution. Enter the agentic control plane. What replaced manual administration isn't a tool, it's a system, and the system doesn't wait for you anymore. Agent 365 is the control plane that removes human latency from decision-making entirely. It's not Copilot, it's not automation, it's not another feature bundle. It's the architectural answer to the question you finally asked. How do we eliminate human approval from the authorization engine? Here's how it works at the foundation level. Every AI agent in your organization gets a Microsoft Entra agent ID, not a service account, not a shared credential, an identity, first class, treated like a user, assigned to a principal, accountable. Every agent has an owner, every agent has a defined purpose, every agent has a life cycle, birth, operation, retirement, just like a human identity, just like you. This is the first revolution. You no longer approve access for agents, the system does. An agent is created with defined scope, the exact permissions it needs to accomplish its function and nothing more. Not standing privilege, not access to everything until someone remembers to revoke it. Defined scope. Entra enforces it. Conditional access applies to it. Risk signals flow through it. If the agent behaves anomalously, access is revoked. Automatically, not after review, not after approval, immediately. Access decisions are no longer made by humans checking boxes quarterly. They're made by systems evaluating signals continuously. Risk scores change in real time. Device compliance changes, location changes, time of day changes, threat patterns emerge. The system responds. No human approval required, no checkbox theater, no "I'll review it next quarter." The system enforces intent in real time, every millisecond, every decision. The AI administrator role doesn't click buttons anymore. It defines the rules that agents enforce. You write policy once, you define it cleanly. You specify the intent. You say, an agent can provision users to this group, but only if the requesting user is in the HR department, only if they're using a managed device, only if they're within the allowed time window, only if there's no risk signal on their account. You write that once, the system enforces it millions of times. You don't approve each provisioning, you don't review each decision. You define the rule once, correctly, without exceptions. The system handles the rest. This is the satisfaction. Policies are no longer static documents that calcify under the weight of exceptions. They're continuous evaluations of risk and intent. The policy doesn't say access is approved. The policy says access is evaluated based on these signals. Is the device managed? Is the user location trusted? Is there a risk indicator? Is the time within the defined window? The system evaluates these signals continuously. The answer changes in real time based on current state, not based on a decision made months ago. Here's the architectural shift that matters. The system no longer waits for you to approve. It acts based on deterministic rules you've defined once. You don't approve Teams provisioning, you define the rules for Teams provisioning. The system creates teams according to those rules. You don't approve access requests. You define the conditions under which access is automatically granted. The system evaluates those conditions and acts. Approval isn't the governance mechanism anymore. Definition is, you govern by defining intent clearly once, without exceptions. The system enforces it continuously. And here's the satisfying part. There's no theater anymore. No checkbox approval that no one read. No quarterly review where 40% of owners don't respond. No compliance artifacts documenting decisions that were already made. The system enforces policy according to defined rules. Either the decision is made automatically according to those rules, or it's escalated to a human if the rules don't cover it. No default permit. No standing privilege. No, I approved it because no one said no. By 2026, organizations that implemented this model reported something that had never happened before under manual administration. They actually understood their permission state. Not perfectly, but actually, they could reason about why a user had access to a resource. Because access had been granted according to defined criteria, not according to historical precedent. They could audit the system, because every decision was made according to documented rules. They could enforce policy consistently, because the system didn't have human inconsistency. This is what replaced you. Not a faster admin, not a better approval process. A system that removed the need for human approval from the authorization engine entirely. Identity as the decision engine. The first layer of replacement is identity governance. This is where the transformation becomes visible. This is where Entra ID stops being an authentication system and becomes something else entirely. For years, Entra ID was the thing that verified you were who you claimed to be. You logged in. Entra checked your credentials. If they were valid, you got in. That was the extent of it. Authentication was a checkpoint. Pass or fail. Yes or no. Once you passed, the system assumed your access was good until someone explicitly revoked it. Standing privilege. Permanent, unless someone remembered to remove it. Entra ID is not that anymore. Entra ID is now the authorization decision engine. Every access decision flows through it, not once per login, continuously, every request, every resource, every moment. The system is asking, given the current state of this user, given the current risk environment, given the current policies, should access be granted right now? That's not authentication, that's continuous authorization. Watch how this works in practice. A user logs in from a managed device. Risk score is low, time is business hours, location is a trusted office. Conditional access evaluates all of these factors. Access is granted, but the user opens a file that triggers a data loss prevention rule. The system notes the activity. Risk score adjusts. The user then attempts to access a sensitive resource that they've never accessed before. The risk calculation changes again. Access is denied, not because they did something wrong, because the pattern changed, because the signals shifted, because the system detected something that looked different from normal behavior. This happens continuously, not quarterly, not manually. The system doesn't wait for a human to notice the pattern. The system notices it. The system acts. The second shift is in how privilege operates. Just-in-time access means privilege is ephemeral, temporary, defined. You need elevated access. You request it. The system grants it for exactly as long as you specified. 4 hours, 8 hours, 1 day, not longer. The access expires. The system revokes it. You don't have to remember to ask for removal. The system removes it automatically. Standing privilege becomes the exception, not the default. This inverts the entire permission model. Instead of access lives forever until revoked, it becomes access expires unless explicitly extended. Instead of quarterly reviews certifying that people should keep access, it becomes automatic revocation unless someone actively justifies the extension. The justification changes everything. When you request extended access, you have to say why. The system records the justification. The next time the access is about to expire, the system checks, is this justification still valid? Has the situation changed? If the justification no longer applies, the access expires. If it still applies, the extension is auto-approved based on documented criteria. You're no longer approving access arbitrarily. You're evaluating whether documented reasons still justify extended privilege. The approval is tied to facts, not to hope that someone will remember to revoke it later. The third shift is in risk-based revocation. The system continuously monitors behavioral signals, login patterns, resource access patterns, data movements, unusual activities. If something triggers a risk indicator, compromise, anomalous behavior, threat pattern match, the system doesn't wait for a review cycle. The system revokes access immediately, automatically, not after investigation, not after approval, immediately. The user can request reinstatement once the risk is cleared. This removes the window where an attacker could maintain persistence. Under manual administration, a compromised account could persist for weeks before someone noticed it in an access review. Under this system, risk signals trigger immediate revocation. The final shift is in automation. You don't approve each decision. You define the rules. You say, if a user requests access to this resource, grant it if they're in this department and using a managed device and risk score is below this threshold. Otherwise, escalate. You write that once. The system makes that decision thousands of times per day. You don't touch it. Human latency is gone. The authorization engine makes decisions in milliseconds based on real-time signals. It doesn't wait for quarterly approval. It doesn't wait for anything. This is identity as the decision engine, not identity as the gatekeeper. Identity as the continuous evaluator of who should have access right now based on current state, current signals, current policy. This is what removed the need for you to approve access. The system approves it based on rules you defined once. Purview as the intent enforcer. The second layer of replacement is data governance. This is where intent becomes enforceable policy. This is where Purview stops being a compliance tool and becomes the mechanism through which the system enforces what you intended to happen. Sensitivity labels used to be metadata. A file was marked as confidential. That label sat on the file. It communicated something to anyone reading it, but enforcement was optional. A user could see the label and choose to ignore it. They could share a confidential file with someone outside the organization because nothing technically prevented it. The label was a suggestion. It was documentation. It was a hint about how you should treat the file. It wasn't enforcement. Sensitivity labels are not that anymore. A file is labeled as confidential. The label isn't metadata anymore. It's policy. It's executable. The system evaluates the label and enforces consequences based on it. Who can access the file? The system determines that from the label. Can the file be copied? The label says no, so the system prevents it. Can it be forwarded? The label specifies who it can be forwarded to. The system enforces that. Can it be printed? The label controls that. Can it be edited? The label controls that. The label isn't documentation. It's a set of executable enforcement rules. This is the shift from hope to certainty. You no longer hope that users understand confidential means confidential. You no longer rely on training or policy documents to guide behavior. The system enforces the label. The label contains intent. The system executes intent. If the label says this data is restricted to the HR department, the system will not allow anyone outside HR to access it. Not because they're trained, not because they understand the policy, because the system prevented it technically. Data loss prevention no longer requires manual review. Someone attempts to share a file containing credit card numbers. The system detects it. The system blocks it. Not after audit, not after compliance review. Immediately. The system evaluated the content against defined rules. The content violated policy. The system prevented the action. No human approval required. No remediation after the fact. Prevention at the point of action. Auto-classification means the system identifies what data is, not humans hoping they remember to label it. A file is created containing salary information. The system scans it. The system detects that it contains personally identifiable information and financial data. The system applies the confidential label automatically. The user doesn't have to remember to classify it. The user doesn't have to know what the classification policy is. The system knows, the system enforces it. This inverts the entire governance model. Instead of documents being unlabeled by default and requiring humans to remember to label them, documents are classified automatically. Instead of policy being enforced by user behavior, policy is enforced by the system. Instead of governance being something that depends on user training and compliance culture, governance is something that happens automatically regardless of user behavior. Retention policies execute automatically. Data is retained according to defined schedules. When retention expires, data is deleted, not after manual review, not after audit, automatically. The system executes the policy without human intervention. Your quarterly cleanup project becomes irrelevant because the system cleaned it up according to policy. This is the satisfaction of the system. You don't manage governance anymore. You define it once. You specify intent. You say what should be true of the system. The system enforces what you intended. If you intended for confidential data to be restricted to certain users, the system restricts it. If you intended for personal data to be deleted after 2 years, the system deletes it. If you intended for payment card data to never be copied, the system prevents copying. Governance is no longer a process you manage. It's a policy the system enforces. And the system is far better at enforcement than humans ever were. The system doesn't forget. The system doesn't make exceptions. The system doesn't get tired or distracted or compromise its standards under business pressure. The system enforces exactly what you told it to enforce, millions of times a day, with perfect consistency. This is what replaced the hope that users would follow policy. This is what replaced the assumption that training would change behavior. The system doesn't need users to understand policy. The system needs you to define it. Then the system enforces it. Agent 365 as the orchestration layer. The third layer of replacement is where the revolution becomes complete. This is Agent 365. This is not a dashboard. This is not a monitoring tool. This is the control plane that orchestrates the autonomous actors within your infrastructure. You've spent years orchestrating humans, assigning tasks, defining who does what, managing dependencies, ensuring that complex work flows through the right sequence of people. Someone provisioned a user, someone else configured their email, someone else applied group memberships, someone else granted access to SharePoint. Each step required human action. Each step was a delay. Each step was a chance for something to be missed or misconfigured. Agent 365 removes the human from that orchestration entirely. Here's what it means in practice. An AI agent is created. The agent has a defined purpose, provision users to a specific group. The agent is assigned identity in Entra. The agent receives exactly the permissions it needs to accomplish that one task. Not standing privilege, not access to everything until someone remembers to revoke it. Exactly the permissions required. The agent can create user accounts. The agent can add them to the specific group. The agent cannot access any other data. The agent cannot modify any other systems. The agent cannot escalate its own privilege. This is the first principle. Every agent is scoped. Every agent has boundaries. Every agent operates under constraint. But here's where it becomes orchestration. That provisioning agent can be one step in a larger workflow. A request comes in. An agent evaluates whether it meets defined criteria. Another agent provisions the user. A third agent sends a notification email. A fourth agent updates a tracking system. A fifth agent creates a calendar entry. The workflow executes automatically. No human deciding which step comes next. No human coordinating between systems. No human reviewing the intermediate states. The agents coordinate with each other based on defined workflow logic. Watch what happens when something goes wrong. An agent attempts an action that violates policy. The system detects it. The agent is auto-blocked. Not after investigation, not after someone decides it's a problem. Automatically, the agent is removed from operation immediately. Risk signal detected, access revoked, system protected, no human latency, no delay waiting for someone to notice the problem. Watch what happens to inactive agents. An agent hasn't executed any actions in 30 days. The system marks it for review. 60 days of inactivity. The system auto-deletes it. You don't have to remember to clean up old agents. You don't have to audit the agent inventory annually. The system maintains inventory automatically. Inactive agents are removed. Dead agents are retired. Orphaned agents are reassigned to managers. The system manages the agent lifecycle the way it manages the user lifecycle, automatically, continuously. This is the shift that matters. You no longer orchestrate agents manually. The system orchestrates them. You define the orchestration rules once. You specify what agents should do, in what sequence, under what conditions. The system executes that orchestration millions of times without human involvement. Here's the architectural truth that emerges. Humans were the bottleneck in orchestration. You had to decide which tool to use. You had to decide in what sequence. You had to coordinate between systems. You had to escalate when something didn't fit the defined workflow. You had to make exceptions. You had to document decisions. Every decision was a delay. Every delay was an opportunity for the business to work around you. Now, the orchestration happens automatically. The system coordinates actions across multiple agents. The system makes decisions about sequencing based on defined rules. The system escalates only when something genuinely requires human judgment. The system doesn't wait for approval. It acts according to defined intent. And it acts faster than any human could ever coordinate manually. By 2026, organizations that implemented agentic orchestration reported something unprecedented. Workflows that used to take days now completed in minutes. Provisioning that required coordination across 4 departments now happened automatically. Access requests that used to pass through multiple approval gates now executed according to defined criteria. The complexity didn't decrease, but the human latency disappeared. This is what replaced the orchestration admin, not a faster person coordinating between systems. A system that coordinates automatically according to defined rules. A system that manages agent lifecycle without human involvement. A system that detects and prevents problems before they affect the business. This is Agent 365, the orchestration layer that removes humans from orchestration entirely. The Copilot shift from assistance to autonomy. Copilot represents the moment when the system stopped asking for permission and started asking for intent. This distinction matters. It's not semantic, it's architectural. For years, you've thought of Copilot as a helper, a tool you use. You ask it a question, it gives you an answer. You ask it to draft something. It suggests text. You ask it to analyze data. It shows you patterns. Copilot is an assistant. It's there when you need it. You initiate. Copilot responds. That's assistance. That's not what Copilot is anymore. Copilot has shifted into something else. Agent mode in Word, Excel, and PowerPoint means Copilot doesn't wait for your request anymore. You describe what you want. You say, make this document match the brand guidelines. You don't tell it how. You don't click buttons. You describe intent. Copilot understands intent. Copilot executes it. Copilot edits the document autonomously, without asking permission for each change. You review what it did. You accept or reject. But Copilot made the decisions. Copilot determined the edits. Copilot moved from suggesting changes to making them. This is the shift, from assistance to autonomy. Watch what happens when you shift that paradigm. Under the assistance model, you have to know what you want. You describe the problem. Copilot helps you solve it. You're still the director. You're still making decisions. Copilot is providing suggestions and information to help you decide better. Under the autonomy model, you describe the outcome you want. You don't describe the steps. Copilot determines the steps. Copilot doesn't show you its work for approval. Copilot acts according to defined intent. You're no longer deciding what changes to make. You're deciding whether the outcome matches what you intended. The first model requires you to understand the problem deeply enough to direct the solution. The second model requires you to understand the desired outcome, but not the path to get there. The system determines the path. This is why it matters. The assistance model still requires human direction at each step. You have to know what to ask for. You have to know what information matters. You have to understand the domain well enough to evaluate Copilot's suggestions. The human is still the bottleneck. You're just using a better tool to help you think. The autonomy model removes human direction from the execution. You describe intent. The system executes. The human becomes a validator, not a director. You're no longer making decisions about how to accomplish the task. You're evaluating whether the task was accomplished correctly. This is the architectural revolution. You've moved from human decides, AI helps, to human describes, AI decides. The decision-making moves from you to the system. The system is now the actor. You're now the arbiter. But here's where it gets interesting. This only works if the system actually understands intent. And understanding intent requires something more than just answering questions. It requires the system to know what you value. It requires organizational context. It requires understanding your business logic, your standards, your constraints. It requires the system to have access to what you intended to build, not just what you asked it to do. This is where work IQ enters. This is where the system learns organizational memory. Every meeting you attend, every document you create, every decision you make, the system observes it. The system builds a model of how you think, what you value, what you consider correct, what your standards are. When you describe intent, the system doesn't just guess. The system knows your preferences. The system knows your domain. The system knows what success looks like because it's seen thousands of examples of your work. Now, Copilot doesn't just execute instructions. Copilot executes intent according to your specific context. When you say, make this compliant with our guidelines, Copilot knows your guidelines because it's seen your documents. It's seen your standards. It knows what you consider compliant. This is what separates a general-purpose assistant from an autonomous actor working within organizational context. The general assistant needs you to specify everything. The organizational agent understands context, understands intent, executes according to your specific business logic. By 2026, this shift was complete. Copilot moved from helper to actor, from suggestion-based to autonomy-based, from here's information to help you decide to here's what I did based on what you intended. The human moved from director to validator, from making decisions to evaluating whether decisions were made correctly, from active participation in execution to oversight of autonomous execution. This is the moment when you stopped being the operator and became the supervisor. The skill shift, from operator to architect. If the system replaced manual operators, what happened to the people who were operators? The answer matters because the answer determines whether you survived this transition or became obsolete. The admin role didn't disappear, it transformed. And transformation is harsher than replacement because transformation requires you to become someone different while still being responsible for the work. You used to be an operator. You managed systems, you clicked buttons, you ran scripts, you approved requests, you reviewed policies, you executed decisions, your value was in execution. How fast could you provision a user? How many access reviews could you process? How quickly could you respond to requests? You were measured on speed and thoroughness. How many tickets did you close? How many configurations did you deploy? Your work was visible. Your impact was measurable. You did things. Things happened. That's not what the architect does. The architect no longer manages systems. The architect designs systems. You don't click buttons anymore. You define the rules that buttons follow. You don't approve requests anymore. You design the logic that approves requests automatically. You don't review policies anymore. You architect the policies that enforce themselves. Your value is no longer in execution. Your value is in design. This requires different skills, completely different. Execution skills, how to use the interface, how to navigate complex configurations, how to remember the sequence of steps, become irrelevant. The interface doesn't matter if the system is executing automatically. The configuration steps don't matter if you're defining rules, not executing them. The sequence of actions doesn't matter if the system is orchestrating actions, not humans. What matters now is system thinking. How do policies interact? What happens when this rule meets this other rule? Where are the logical inconsistencies? Where will exceptions accumulate? How do you define intent cleanly enough that a machine can enforce it consistently? How do you scope agent permissions so that the agent can accomplish its purpose without introducing new risks? How do you design for the exceptions that don't yet exist? These are architect skills, and they're the opposite of operator skills. An operator memorizes steps. An architect thinks about systems. An operator executes decisions. An architect defines decision logic. An operator manages complexity. An architect eliminates complexity by designing systems that prevent it. Here's what the research showed. Entry-level IT admin positions declined 13%. Not because there's less work, because the work that entry-level admins used to do, the ticket processing, the provisioning, the policy application, is now automated. You don't need someone to process provisioning tickets. The system provisions automatically. You don't need someone to apply policies. The system applies them. You don't need entry-level admins doing task execution anymore. But mid-level architects, the people with 5 to 10 years of experience, the people who understood why policies were written the way they were, the people who understood the business logic behind the configurations, demand for those people went up because those are the people who can design systems that work, who can translate business intent into policy, who can architect governance frameworks that actually scale. This is the skill shift that matters. The operator who got really good at clicking buttons, who memorized the interface, who could provision faster than anyone else, that person became obsolete. Not because they were replaced by a tool, because the tool eliminated the work they did. The operator's skill set, speed, thoroughness, attention to detail in task execution, became irrelevant in a system where tasks execute automatically. But the operator who also understood why the system was designed that way, who understood the intent behind the policies, who could think about how systems interact, that person became an architect. That person learned to think about design instead of execution. That person survived. That person thrived. That person is now in higher demand than ever. The brutal part is this. If you've spent 5 years getting really good at operator skills, if your entire value is tied to execution speed and thoroughness, you have to learn entirely new skills or you become irrelevant. And learning entirely new skills is harder than learning to execute faster. It requires you to unlearn what made you valuable. It requires you to think differently. It requires you to understand systems at a level that task execution never required. Entry-level hiring dropped because the system doesn't need entry-level operators anymore. Mid-level hiring increased because the system needs architects. The people who survived the transition were the ones who learned to think like architects. The ones who didn't became the unemployment statistics. This is the uncomfortable truth. The system didn't need you to get better at what you were doing. The system needed you to stop doing it and become someone else. And becoming someone else is harder than getting faster at what you already do. The governance stack. How it all connects. The real power isn't in any single tool. The real power is in how they work together. And that coherence is what manual administration could never achieve. Think about what happens when a provisioning request comes in. Under manual administration, the request would pass through human hands. It would approve it, HR would verify it, security would check it, finance would confirm budget, each person would review, add comments, escalate if needed. Weeks would pass, then someone would finally execute the provisioning. Under the agentic model, the request flows through the governance stack, and every layer adds something different, every layer enforces something different, every layer makes the final outcome more certain. The request enters Entra ID first. This is the identity layer. Entra evaluates the request against identity governance rules. Is the requesting user authorized to make provisioning requests? Are they in the right department? Are their credentials valid? Has their account been flagged for risk? Entra makes these decisions in milliseconds based on signals. The request either passes through or is rejected at the identity layer. If it passes, it moves to conditional access. This is the temporal and risk layer. Conditional access evaluates context. Is the request coming from a trusted location? Is it coming at a reasonable time? Is the requesting device managed? Is there an anomaly in the pattern? Conditional access applies time-based and signal-based rules. The request either proceeds or triggers additional verification. If it passes conditional access, it moves to the authorization engine. This is where scope is determined. What exactly can this request create? Not what the user asked for. What the governance rules permit. Can this user provision to this group? Can this user assign this license? Can this user grant this access? The authorization engine answers these questions based on defined policy. It doesn't ask for approval. It evaluates policy and determines what's permissible. If authorization passes, the request reaches Agent 365. This is the agentic layer. Agent 365 determines which agents can execute this request. What automation should run, in what sequence, with what constraints. Agent 365 orchestrates the agents. One agent creates the user account, another applies the license, another adds the user to the group, another sends notification, another updates the tracking system, all coordinated automatically, all executing in defined sequence, all operating within the scope determined by the authorization layer. During execution, Power Automate handles the workflow logic. Power Automate doesn't execute autonomously. Power Automate executes what the agents tell it to execute. But Power Automate enforces the workflow. It ensures steps happen in the right order. It handles escalations if something fails. It manages the state of the provisioning throughout execution. While all this is happening, Microsoft Graph is being accessed. Graph retrieves the information needed. Graph updates the directory. Graph notifies dependent systems. Graph is the data layer underlying everything. Every layer reads from Graph. Every layer writes to Graph. Graph maintains the source of truth. And throughout this entire flow, Purview is evaluating data. What data is being accessed? What data is being created? What data sensitivity labels apply? Purview enforces data governance rules in real time. If someone attempts to share sensitive data inappropriately, Purview detects it and blocks it. Purview doesn't wait. Purview enforces continuously. Finally, Defender is observing. Defender watches every action. Is the provisioning normal? Is the scope appropriate? Is the agent behaving as expected? Is there a threat signal? Defender maintains visibility. If something looks wrong, Defender alerts. If something looks like compromise, Defender revokes access. Defender is the eyes that never stop watching. This entire flow, from request entry to execution to monitoring, happens in seconds. No human approval, no waiting, no exceptions, no theater. The request either completes according to defined governance or fails at a specific layer with documented reason. The coherence is what matters. Each layer enforces something different. Identity enforces who can request. Context enforces when and where. Authorization enforces what scope is permissible. Agents enforce execution order. Graph enforces data consistency. Purview enforces data protection. Defender enforces security. Together, they form a unified system where governance is embedded at every layer. Manual administration couldn't achieve this because no human could coordinate across 7 different governance layers simultaneously. But the system doesn't need humans to coordinate. The system is designed for automatic coordination. Each layer does its job. Each layer trusts the others. The result is governance that's comprehensive, consistent, and enforced automatically. This is the governance stack, not a dashboard, not a reporting tool, a system where every decision point is governed, where every layer enforces something, where the entire flow is auditable, repeatable, and deterministic. This is what replaced the administrator who had to manually enforce governance across 7 different tools. The uncomfortable truth about job displacement. Let's address what everyone is thinking, but no one is saying clearly. 30% of US companies have replaced some workers with AI, not reduced their hours, not reassigned them, replaced them. They're gone. 30%, that's not a rounding error. That's a significant portion of the market making the decision that the work those people did could be done by a system instead. 38% of employers have cut entry-level roles due to AI. Entry-level positions, the positions that were supposed to be the pipeline, the positions that trained people to become architects, the positions that taught the fundamentals of how systems work. Those positions are disappearing, not transforming, disappearing. Organizations are deciding they don't need entry-level workers anymore because the system handles the entry-level work. In the first half of 2025 alone, 77,999 tech jobs were lost to AI. Not reductions, not salary cuts, jobs eliminated. That's hundreds of people every single day losing employment because a system could do what they did. And that number is accelerating. Every quarter, the number gets larger. Every wave of automation removes more jobs. But here's what the headlines miss. While 77,000 jobs were being eliminated, 1.3 million new jobs were being created globally. AI-related jobs, prompt engineers, AI strategists, system designers, risk managers, governance specialists, jobs that didn't exist 3 years ago are now in high demand. The net effect isn't negative. The net effect by 2030 is projected to be 78 million more jobs created than eliminated globally, a massive net positive. But, and this is the uncomfortable part, those aren't the same jobs in the same places filled by the same people. The IT support person who spent a decade getting good at troubleshooting, the job they did is now handled by an AI ticketing system. They can't migrate that expertise to a prompt engineer role. The skills don't transfer. The tickets they used to handle are gone. The job they were good at no longer exists. The young person who was going to spend 3 years as an entry-level admin, learning the fundamentals, building toward a mid-level role, there is no entry-level admin role anymore. The system does that work, so that person either doesn't enter IT at all or they enter at a higher skill level immediately with less training and less safety net. The mid-level admin who had 12 years of experience, who understood the business deeply, who could architect governance frameworks, that person is in higher demand than ever. Demand for mid-level architects is up, way up. The person with 5 to 10 years of experience is the most valuable person in the market right now, because those are the people who can design systems that work, the people who understand intent, the people who can think about consequences. So the displacement is real, but it's not displacement of all jobs. It's displacement of entry-level jobs and displacement of pure operator roles. It's replacement of high-volume, low-skill work with high-value, high-skill work. This matters because it determines whether you survived or became a statistic. If your entire value was tied to how fast you could click buttons, you're in the statistics. The system clicks buttons faster. If your entire value was tied to being the person who processes tickets, you're in the statistics. The system processes tickets. If your entire value was tied to being the gatekeeper who approves access, you're in the statistics. The system approves access. But if your value was in understanding why the system was designed that way, if your value was in knowing what decisions matter and which don't, if your value was in seeing how policies interact and preventing entropy before it becomes unmanageable, then you became more valuable, not less. The demand for people who can think about these things went up, while the demand for people who execute them went down. This is the uncomfortable truth. The system didn't replace bad admins. It replaced operator-level work, and replacing operator-level work is what transforms an industry. It eliminates the entry point, it removes the training ground, it forces everyone who enters the field to enter with more existing knowledge and fewer safety nets. This isn't tragedy, it's evolution. But evolution is uncomfortable. Evolution eliminates niches. Evolution removes species that can't adapt. And evolution doesn't care about your plans. The people who survived were the ones who understood this was happening and adapted. The people who didn't became the employment statistics. And by 2026, the statistics were clear. Entry-level hiring was down 13%. Mid-level architect demand was up dramatically. The market had spoken. The system had changed. And the people who survived were the ones who saw it coming and changed with it. The governance first imperative. This is the critical insight that separates the organizations that thrived from the ones that merely survived. Most organizations treat governance as a brake on innovation, a checkbox, something compliance requires you to do, something security insists on, something that slows down deployment and makes business teams frustrated. Governance is the thing you do after you've proven the value of something. You build a proof of concept. You show the business impact. Then reluctantly you add governance. You implement controls. You slow things down to acceptable risk. Governance is the cost you pay for innovation. The overhead, the bureaucracy that prevents good things from happening fast. That's backwards. That's the thinking that created shadow AI in the first place. That's the thinking that makes organizations choose unsanctioned tools over approved workflows. That's the thinking that makes employees wait 2 weeks for approval and then solve the problem themselves on personal accounts. Leading organizations understood something different. They understood that governance isn't a brake on innovation. Governance is the foundation for scaling it. Think about what happens when you deploy agents without governance. You want to move fast. You build an agent to automate something. You test it. It works. You deploy it. Great. But you didn't define scope clearly. You didn't document intent. You didn't establish lifecycle rules. So now you have an agent that does work. And you have no idea what it's doing, how to revoke it, who's using it, or what happens if it behaves unexpectedly. The agent is operational. But it's also a risk. You're moving fast towards something you don't understand. Then another team builds another agent. They do the same thing. Fast deployment. Minimal governance, no documentation, no scope definition, no lifecycle management. Now you have 2 agents and you understand neither of them. They might interact with each other. They might conflict. You don't know. By the time you have 10 agents without governance, you're in chaos. You've built 10 things fast, but you can't manage them. You can't audit them. You can't understand what they're doing. And by then, the cost of adding governance is massive. You have to retrofit controls onto systems that were never designed for them. You have to untangle dependencies you didn't know existed. This is the alternative. Define governance first. Before you build the agent, define its scope. Document its purpose, specify what access it needs, define how it will behave, establish lifecycle rules. Then build the agent according to the governance framework. The agent is born into a controlled environment. It operates within defined boundaries. It can be audited, it can be revoked, it can be monitored, it has lifecycle, it has accountability. Now you build another agent. Same process. Defined governance, clear scope, documented intent. The system is coherent. You understand how this agent relates to the previous one. You understand what data they might access. You understand what controls apply. The organizations that moved fastest to agentic systems weren't the ones with the most resources. They weren't the ones with the biggest budgets. They were the ones that implemented governance first. They were the ones that understood this principle. And the data bears this out. By Q2 2026, governance-first organizations had deployment cycles that were 3 to 5 times faster than governance-reactive ones. 3 to 5 times. Not marginally better, not slightly ahead, dramatically faster. This is counterintuitive because governance feels like constraint. It feels like it slows things down. But when you implement governance first, governance becomes infrastructure. Governance becomes the foundation that makes scale possible. You're not adding governance to existing systems and trying to retrofit controls. You're building new systems within a governance framework. The framework is there from the beginning. The system is born compliant. The system is born auditable. The system is born within constraint. And constraints enable speed. They enable confidence. They enable scaling because you know exactly what the system can do. You know exactly what it cannot do. You know exactly how to monitor it. You know exactly how to revoke it if something goes wrong. Governance-first organizations deployed agents faster because they didn't spend 3 months retrofitting controls after the agent was already operational. They didn't inherit shadow AI because agents were governed from inception. They didn't struggle with agent sprawl because lifecycle rules were defined before agents existed. This is not a security trade-off. This is not a choice between speed and safety. Governance first is faster and safer simultaneously. Governance first is the competitive advantage. The deterministic intent model. This is the architectural principle that makes everything work. This is the foundation that separates a system that scales from a system that eventually collapses under its own weight. Manual administration was reactive. Something breaks. You fix it. A user loses access. You investigate and regrant it. A policy is violated. You remediate it. A site is over-permissioned. You tighten it. You react to problems as they emerge. You fix fires. You restore things that broke. You are always one step behind the chaos, always cleaning up the entropy that the system created while you weren't watching. Agentic administration is different. It's proactive. You define intent before the system operates. You specify what should be true. Access expires by default unless explicitly extended. Sites are archived automatically after inactivity. Data is classified at creation, not after discovery. Permissions are scoped at provisioning, not loosened and then tightened when someone notices they're too broad. You don't react to problems. You define rules that prevent them. This distinction matters architecturally. It's the difference between a probabilistic system and a deterministic one. A deterministic system means the same input always produces the same output. You request access to a resource under these conditions. The system evaluates those conditions against defined policy. The system grants or denies access. Every time, consistently, auditably. The decision is tied to documented rules. The outcome is predictable. You can reason about what the system will do because the system behaves according to defined logic. A probabilistic system means the outcome depends on who's making the decision. You request access. It depends on which admin reviews it. One admin approves it, another admin denies it. The outcome is inconsistent because humans are inconsistent. You can't predict what will happen because the decision isn't tied to defined logic. The decision is tied to human judgment, and human judgment varies. Every exception you granted in the manual era made the system more probabilistic. You said yes to a request that didn't quite fit the policy. You made an exception. The exception documented one outcome. But next time, someone else faced a similar request and didn't know about your exception. They made a different decision. The system became less consistent, less predictable, less auditable. Every exception added a branch in the decision tree. Every branch made the tree more complex. Every branch made it harder to reason about what the system would do. By the end, the system wasn't following policy. The system was following precedent. And precedent is just the accumulated weight of previous exceptions. Every policy you define in the agentic era makes the system more deterministic. You write a rule, the system enforces it. Millions of times. Every decision is made according to the same logic. Every decision produces the same outcome given the same input. The system is consistent, auditable, predictable. You can reason about what the system will do because the system's behavior is defined in code, not in human judgment. Deterministic systems are auditable. You can trace every decision back to the rule that produced it. You can investigate incidents because the decision logic is documented. You can defend your decisions because they're tied to defined policy, not to individual judgment. Deterministic systems are predictable. You know what access a user will receive because you know the policy. You know what will happen to a resource after inactivity because you know the lifecycle rules. You know what will happen to data because you know the classification logic. Predictability enables confidence. Confidence enables scaling. Deterministic systems are scalable. You can apply the same policy to millions of decisions without hiring more people to make those decisions. You can audit millions of actions without manual review. You can enforce consistency at scale because the system doesn't have human inconsistency. Probabilistic systems are fragile. They break under their own weight. Every exception adds complexity. Every special case adds a branch. Eventually, the decision tree is so complex that no one understands it. The system becomes unmaintainable. The system becomes a liability. The shift from probabilistic to deterministic is the real architectural revolution. This is why the downfall of manual admin is satisfying. You're not just replacing a person with a system. You're moving from a system that depends on human judgment to a system that depends on defined logic. You're moving from hope to certainty, from inconsistency to determinism, from reactive firefighting to proactive enforcement. This is what makes the agentic model work at scale. Not the speed, not the automation, the determinism, the certainty, the audibility, the ability to reason about what the system will do because the system's behavior is defined, not decided. The three scenarios transformed. Let's bring this back to concrete examples that every admin recognizes. Let's take the three scenarios that defined manual administration and watch them transform under the agentic model. Scenario 1, access reviews. This is the checkbox theater that every organization practices. Manual administration made you review access quarterly. Owners receive a notification. 40% don't respond. You approve anyway because the alternative is blocking access to people who need it. Risky access remains standing because the person who granted it is no longer in the organization. You're not reviewing access. You're documenting compliance theater. You're creating artifacts that prove you tried, knowing the whole time that standing access is still sitting there, unchanged, unreviewed, unrevoked. Under the agentic model, access reviews don't happen quarterly. They happen continuously. The system is asking constantly, is this access still justified? Has the risk profile changed? Has the user's role shifted? Has their department changed? Has there been a threat signal? The system evaluates these questions continuously, not waiting for a quarterly calendar event, not waiting for someone to remember to run the review. Continuously. Risk signals trigger automatic evaluation. If the signal indicates the access should be revoked, the system revokes it immediately, not after investigation, not after approval, immediately. The shift is from, did we review it, to, is it still justified? Access expires by default. Extension requires justification. Justification is evaluated against current context. If the justification no longer applies, access expires. No theater, no checkbox, just continuous evaluation and automatic enforcement. Scenario 2, team lifecycle. Manual administration created a simple problem. Teams are created in seconds. They live forever. Owners leave the organization. Sites become orphaned. Data retention policies are written once, never tuned. By year 3, no one knows what half the sites contain. You can't delete them because someone might need them. You can't keep them because they're consuming resources and creating security surface. The system created complexity faster than you could govern it. Under the agentic model, teams are auto-provisioned based on organizational intent. Teams are created with defined retention policies. Teams are automatically archived after defined inactivity periods. If a team owner leaves, ownership is automatically reassigned to their manager. If ownership cannot be established, the team is automatically flagged for review. After a defined retention period, the team is automatically deleted unless explicitly extended. The system doesn't ask whether you should clean this up. The system enforces that cleanup happens automatically. The shift is from should we clean this up to why does this still exist? If a team exists, there's a documented reason. The reason is auditable. The reason is justified. If the reason no longer applies, the team expires automatically. Scenario 3, data governance. Manual administration treated governance as a documentation exercise. Policies are written once. They're never tuned. Users bypass controls because controls are inconvenient. Shadow sharing happens everywhere because the approve process is too slow. The policy document sits in a shared drive. No one reads it. The system violates the policy daily because enforcement was never built in. Under the agentic model, data is auto-classified at creation. The system identifies what data is. The system applies sensitivity labels automatically. The system enforces protection policies based on those labels. Users don't bypass controls because controls aren't inconvenient. Controls are automatic. If you try to share a file with a sensitivity label that prohibits external sharing, the system prevents it. Not after audit, not after review. Immediately. Real-time enforcement. The policy adapts continuously. As new threats emerge, new signals feed into the classification logic. If a file is being accessed in an anomalous way, protection is automatically strengthened. If a data subject is flagged for risk, data they access is automatically protected more strictly. The shift is from are we compliant to is the system enforcing intent? Compliance is not something you achieve through documentation. Compliance is something the system enforces continuously. These three scenarios are the foundation of manual administration. Access reviews, team lifecycle, data governance. They're also the first things that get replaced when you move to an agentic model. Not because agentic systems are better at doing the same work, but because agentic systems eliminate the work entirely. They make the scenarios irrelevant by building enforcement into the system from the beginning. The implementation reality and what actually changed by May 2026. Theory is elegant. Implementation is messy. But here's what actually happened. Agent 365 entered public preview in March 2026. General availability came May 1st, 2026. This wasn't a surprise product launch. This was the culmination of everything that came before. By May, organizations weren't discovering agentic systems. They were finally getting the control plane they'd been improvising without for months. But here's what matters. Organizations that adopted early didn't replace all their admins. They transformed them. The global admin who'd spent 10 years approving access requests didn't get fired. That person became an AI administrator. Same person, different role, no longer approving individual requests, now defining the rules that approve requests automatically. The skills didn't transfer seamlessly. The work didn't feel similar, but the person survived. The person adapted. The person became valuable in a different way. The AI administrator role was the mechanism that made this transformation possible. This role didn't exist before 2026. By May 2026, it was critical infrastructure. AI admins could now manage agent lifecycle without requiring global admin elevation. They could define rules for auto-blocking risky agents. They could specify auto-deletion for inactive agents. They could set policies for auto-reassigning orphaned agents to managers. Automated agent lifecycle rules rolled out that month. The system started managing agent sprawl without human intervention. This matters because it solved the fundamental problem. Without automated lifecycle management, agents would proliferate indefinitely. The system would create complexity faster than anyone could manage. But with automated lifecycle, agents are born into a governance framework. They live under constraint. They die when they're no longer needed. The system maintains itself. Copilot tasks went live that same month. This wasn't a small feature. This was multi-step workflow automation from natural language prompts. You could describe a complex workflow in English. Copilot would understand it. The system would build it. No coding required, no workflow designer, just description, intent. The system executed it. Organizations that understood this capability deployed workflows in days that used to take weeks to build manually. Power user reports in the Copilot dashboard went live in February. By May, organizations had months of data showing them exactly how users were engaging with Copilot. The reports classified users as power users, habitual users, novices, or non-users. Organizations could target enablement based on actual usage patterns. You didn't need to guess who would benefit from training. You could see it in the data. You could see who was adopting and who was resistant. You could intervene where it mattered. Risk-based AI agent inventories in Microsoft Defender rolled out worldwide in February. By May, security teams had complete visibility into every agent operating in the environment. They could see which agents posed risk. They could see which agents were behaving anomalously. They could see which agents needed immediate attention. This inventory wasn't theoretical, it was operational. Security teams were using it, they were making decisions based on it. They were blocking risky agents before they caused damage. Federated Copilot connectors enabled real-time external data access without indexing. Copilot could connect to Canva, HubSpot, Google Calendar, Google Contacts, not by indexing their data. By connecting directly, querying in real time, the data never left the external system. The connection was governed, the access was logged, but the capability was there. Users could use external data within Copilot without copying it into Microsoft 365. Here's the architectural truth that emerged by May 2026. The system wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, it was sufficient. Sufficient to remove human latency from most decisions, sufficient to automate most routine work, sufficient to scale governance without hiring more governance staff. That's all that was required. Not perfection, sufficiency. Organizations that adapted thrived. They deployed Agent 365 early. They defined governance frameworks in March. They had months of operational experience by May. They'd worked through the hard problems. They'd figured out what worked and what didn't. By mid-2026, they were operating at scale. Organizations that resisted found themselves managing legacy chaos. They'd delayed adoption. They'd questioned whether this was really necessary. They'd wanted to wait for the technology to mature. By May 2026, they were 4 months behind. 4 months behind in governance maturity. 4 months behind in automation. 4 months behind in understanding their own agent sprawl. This is the gap that opens between early adopters and everyone else. Not because early adoption was better, because early adoption gives you months of learning time. Months to figure out what works. Months to build institutional knowledge. Months to establish patterns. By the time the technology is stable, early adopters are already operating at scale. The cost of not adapting. For those who didn't make the shift, the consequences were clear. And they were measured in months, not years. Organizations that treated governance as a checkbox, the ones that had written policies but never enforced them, discovered something brutal. Copilot deployments stalled between weeks 6 and 12, not because Copilot stopped working, because the organization couldn't articulate what Copilot should be allowed to do. They had no governance framework. They had no controls. They had no way to answer basic questions. Can Copilot access this data? Should Copilot be allowed to edit this document? What data is Copilot allowed to see? They'd never had to answer these questions before because Copilot had been optional. Now Copilot was becoming mandatory. Now these questions mattered, and the organizations that had no answers stalled. They spent weeks, 6 through 12, trying to figure out governance that should have been defined before Copilot was even turned on. Organizations that didn't define agent governance before agents proliferated inherited agent sprawl, not controlled sprawl, chaotic sprawl. 50 agents running in production, no documentation, no lifecycle management, no understanding of what they're doing or why, no ability to revoke them if something goes wrong. These organizations faced a choice: spend months retrofitting governance onto existing agents, expensive, error-prone, disruptive, or accept operating in chaos. Many chose chaos. They operated with agents they didn't understand, accessing data they couldn't audit, performing actions they couldn't predict. And they called it business as usual. It wasn't business as usual. It was operational recklessness disguised as pragmatism. Organizations that didn't implement sensitivity labels created data exposure vulnerabilities. They knew Copilot was accessing their data. They didn't know what data Copilot was accessing or who could see the responses. A user asked Copilot a question about salary information. Copilot had access to that data because the user had access. Copilot returned it. The user shared the response with someone outside the organization. The data left the system. The organization never knew. The data wasn't labeled. It wasn't protected. It wasn't governed. By the time they discovered it, the data had already been shared. The vulnerability had already been exploited. Organizations that didn't move to time-bound access maintained standing privilege. Standing privilege is the default state of manual administration. Users have access. Access stays until someone remembers to revoke it, which usually means access stays forever. These organizations faced a choice: audit standing privilege continuously and revoke it when it's no longer justified, expensive, error-prone, never finished, or accept the risk. Many accepted the risk. They maintained environments where users had standing access to data they no longer needed, access that should have expired years ago, privilege that was never questioned because no one was questioning it. Organizations that didn't adopt continuous risk evaluation continued quarterly theater, still running access reviews, still getting 40% response rates, still approving by default, still documenting compliance, knowing the whole time they weren't actually reviewing anything. The theater continued. The checkbox got marked. The governance obligation was satisfied. And the standing privilege remained standing. The cost wasn't just operational. The cost was competitive. By Q4 2026, the gap was undeniable. Organizations with agentic governance deployed 3 to 5 times faster than organizations still clicking buttons. 3 to 5 times, not marginally faster, dramatically faster. Organizations with governance frameworks could add a new agent in days. Organizations without governance needed weeks or months because they had to retrofit controls, document intent, establish oversight. The fast organizations shipped features. The slow organizations debated whether they could afford to take the risk. The manual era didn't end because someone decided it should. It didn't end because Microsoft made it obsolete. It ended because it became uncompetitive. The organizations that adapted moved faster, scaled better, took less risk, and reduced costs. The organizations that didn't were slower, fragile, risky, and expensive. In competitive markets, slow and risky lose. And by the end of 2026, the market had made its judgment. The manual era wasn't just over, it was unviable. The cost of not adapting had become the cost of being in business. What you do this week. This is where theory becomes action, and action is where most organizations fail because action requires you to do something uncomfortable. Action requires you to question assumptions that have been embedded in your infrastructure for years. Action requires you to break things that people depend on. But inaction is no longer an option. The window for gradual transition has closed. By 2026, organizations are either adapting or falling behind. This week, you pick which one you are. Action 1. Implement time-bound access. Enable Entra privileged identity management for your key roles immediately. Not all roles, key roles, the ones that matter. Set a maximum activation duration, 8 hours, not more, not indefinitely. 8 hours means the access expires by default. When the 8 hours ends, the privilege is gone. If the user needs it again, they request it again. Require justification for every activation. Require multi-factor authentication. This is the direct attack on standing privilege. This is the symbolic act that proves you understand the principle. If your access doesn't expire, you don't have governance. You have hope. The prerequisites are straightforward. Entra ID P2 licensing, a role inventory, basic RBAC hygiene. The resistance will be immediate. Legacy automation will break because that automation depended on standing privilege. Users will complain because requesting access again is inconvenient. Leadership may resist because it seems like extra friction. Ignore them. The friction is the point. The friction is what prevents unauthorized access from living indefinitely. The friction is what creates accountability. Do this action this week. Action 2. Deploy one deny first policy. Pick external sharing. Block it by default. Require explicit approval for exceptions. This single policy shifts your entire governance posture from reactive to proactive. Instead of hoping people share safely, you enforce safe sharing by default. Instead of discovering oversharing after it happens, you prevent it before it happens. This is your first step toward deterministic systems. Not probabilistic, deterministic. The same input always produces the same outcome. External sharing request denied, every time. Unless explicitly approved. This policy sounds simple. It's not. It will break workflows. People will complain. Departments will escalate. Your job is not to apologize. Your job is to explain that safe is the default now. Unsafe requires justification. Do this action this week. Action 3. Audit your agent sprawl. Inventory every agent running in your environment. Copilot studio agents, Foundry agents, third-party agents, everything. Document ownership. Who built it? Who maintains it? Assign lifecycle rules. When should this agent expire? Under what conditions should it be deleted? What signals trigger auto-blocking? This inventory will terrify you. You'll discover agents you didn't know existed. Agents built by departments without IT approval. Agents that are accessing data you didn't know they could access. That terror is good. That terror is awareness. That awareness is the foundation for governance. Do this action this week. Action 4. Define intent, not tasks. Stop writing policies about how to do things. Start writing policies about what should be true. Don't write these steps provision a user. Write, new employees receive access within 1 business day. Don't write, run this script quarterly. Write, inactive accounts expire automatically. Don't write, review this policy annually.
Write, policy enforcement is continuous.
This mental shift is the bridge between manual and agentic administration. Manual administration thinks in tasks. Agentic administration thinks in intent. Tasks require humans to execute them. Intent requires systems to enforce it. The shift is uncomfortable because you're thinking at a different level of abstraction. You're not describing work. You're describing desired states. Do this action this week. All 4, not eventually. This week, because every week you delay is a week you're falling further behind. Every week you delay is a week your agents are operating without governance. Every week you delay is a week your standing privilege is standing. Move, now. The architecture of the future. The satisfying part of the downfall of manual admin isn't that the work went away. It's that the wrong kind of work went away. You spent 15 years approving decisions that the system should have been making automatically. You spent 15 years catching configuration drift that should never have happened. You spent 15 years in quarterly theater pretending you were reviewing access when you were actually just documenting compliance theater. All of that work, all of that effort, all of that expertise applied to problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The system didn't fail because you failed. It failed because it required you to exist. What replaced you is colder, more consistent, and more scalable. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't make exceptions. It doesn't hope things will work out. It enforces intent every time, consistently, at machine speed. By 2026, the admin role transformed. The operators who understood this was coming became architects. They saw the shift happening. They adapted. They learned to think about systems instead of tasks. They learned to define intent instead of execute decisions. Those people survived, more than survived. Those people became more valuable than ever. The operators who didn't understand became obsolete. They spent years getting better at clicking buttons. They optimized their task execution. They got really good at the work the system could do better. When the system replaced them, they had no place to land. Their skills were irrelevant. Their expertise was obsolete. They became the employment statistics. This isn't a tragedy, it's evolution. The agentic control plane removes human latency from decision-making. It makes governance deterministic instead of probabilistic. It enforces intent instead of hoping for compliance. Your job now is to define that intent, to architect the rules that agents enforce, to think in systems instead of tasks. This is harder than clicking buttons. It's also more valuable. It's also the only way to scale governance in an environment where decisions are made at machine speed. The downfall of manual admin is satisfying because it proves something architects have known for years. The human was never the bottleneck. The system was. And systems can be fixed. You didn't need to get faster. You needed to remove the requirement for speed. You needed to make decisions automatic. You needed to build systems that don't require human approval to operate. By 2026, those systems existed. Agent 365 was live. Agentic administration was operational. The manual era was over. Not because it was replaced by something better, because it was revealed as architecturally broken. It required humans to make decisions at scale. And no human can make decisions at the speed systems need. If you understand this, you're ready for what comes next. If you don't, you're already obsolete. Subscribe to the M365 FM podcast for more deep dives into the architecture of Microsoft 365, Copilot, and the systems reshaping enterprise IT. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I want to hear what you're building, what's breaking, what you're learning about the shift from manual to agentic administration. The future isn't coming, it's already here.